So we left off in a couple sections were at different places. So I'll review something for everyone. But we had kind of worked through that Countifs formula. We got our frequencies. So one thing that we could do at this point is we know that every observation should only be counted in one of these bins. Okay. So if we add up or use, this built-in sum function in Excel, if we add up our frequencies, well, if every observation is counted once, if we add up all the bins, we should get every observation counted once or the total number of observations there. Okay. So I'll select the cells that I want to add up here in that sum function. And this should tell me the total number of observations. Now, at this point, I could check to make sure that I haven't done something wrong, because another function that we have in Excel that we'll start using is just the count function, not Countifs, it's just count. So when you select observations here, it'll just count them as long as they're not missing. So I'll go over here, select that first cell, hold Control-Shift or Command-Shift on a Mac, hit the down arrow, and then you can see here what it's putting in the formula bar. If you want to just go back up to the top where you have that formula, hit Enter, and it'll send you kind of right, within the same vicinity of where you were typing that. So here we had 50 observations from adding up the frequencies, and if we counted the number of observations in the original data, we got 50. So those match up. So it looks like we did, no glaring mistakes here. Okay. Now, one issue could be at this point, if I wanted to then take these frequencies and put them into a bar graph or create a histogram, I could select the labels, hold Control, select, or probably hold Control or hold Command on Mac, then select my frequencies, go to Insert, and here I'm just choosing from these different chart options. Now, one thing I'll point out here is once we go to Insert, and we're trying to choose our chart here, I just want to choose this column or bar chart. That gives me my histogram, and it uses whatever I selected first or whatever's on the left-hand side as my labels. So that's why I had those typed up ahead of time. Okay. Now, I'll show you how we do this again in just a second. But you could also do something like a pie graph, right? Just inputs the different frequencies for the different bins. So we could do a pie graph or a bar graph here. Now, one thing I'll point out is like these labels, they look a little messy, right? Once we have this column chart, it's, there's a lot of decimal. It doesn't look real pretty, okay? So we're gonna try to fix that here. So I'm gonna go over here. And what I've done here is I basically created the same sort of setup, but instead of using that bin length of about 12,000, I'm just gonna use this bin length that's a little bit smaller. And then on my last bin, I'm gonna create this catch-all category. So I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did before. I'll use that Countifs formula. However, now I'm going to go over here, select my range of data, okay. Scroll back over so I can show this to you. Okay, so C2 through C51, comma, and I only want to count it if it's greater than or equal to 0. So greater than, equal to, and then I'll put an and sign here. Instead of typing in 0, I'll select the cell that has a 0. That way, when I copy this down, it'll use the minimum of the next bin and eventually the maximum of the next bin once we see what I'm about to do here, which is comma, tell it to go back through the data again. And now you only want to count it if it meets this first criteria, that's less than or equal to 0. And if it's less than this 7,500, which, I put 749 here for the labels. Technically, I could have done a very similar thing where I kind of typed it all out with the actual less than or equal to greater than signs. I just got a little bit lazy here. Wanted to make the labels as succinct as possible when people are looking at this. So, I kind of just chose that integer that's just below the maximum of each bin. Right? So instead here, I could have written down that it's greater than or equal to 0 and less than 7,500. So I'm going to select wherever the range of data was that I selected, and I'm going to hit F4 or Fn, give a function key, and then F4, or on a Mac, hitting Command T. Okay? So that freezes those references. So when I copy this down, the range of data reference doesn't change, but the minimum and maximum of each bin, those cell references will update, which is what I want them to do. Okay. So now if I copy this down, I get a slightly different frequency distribution. It's not as heavily concentrated in this lower bin, although it's still pretty heavily concentrated, but kind of allows me to look a little bit more at this distribution. So one thing you'll notice here, when I did the 375,000 or greater, you can use what's called the count if, and I could just count the data if it's greater than 37,500. But because I had already typed out the count ifs and I knew that if I just copied it down, it would work. One way to kind of do this catch-all category is I did the minimum as 37,500 and the maximum was just a number that was way greater than the maximum in my data set. So I make sure that I know I'm going to count every observation. So there's multiple ways of doing the same thing. Once again, did we get the total number of observations to be 50? We can use that sum function, select our frequencies. They hopefully will add up to 50. Sure enough, they did. And we could use that check function again if we wanted to, which was that count function, and then go over, just select, and then enter. All right, that puts that cell reference in there. We see that there are, in fact, 50 observations. Okay. So at this point, we could put these into a histogram, or I could go through a couple other things, which is, we said we wanted to sometimes do relative frequencies. So if we, oops, if I double click there, you can kind of see the whole word. Here I'm going to abbreviate this just so that it's not quite as large of a, and double click, auto kind of fits. I'll do the same thing here just so I can get a little bit more of the same screen. So if I want to do a relative frequency, all that's going to be is taking that frequency and dividing it by my total number of observations, which I have right here. Now, when I copy this down, so this should give me some value between 0 and 1. Our relative frequencies represent proportions. And I want to come up with a relative frequency for each bin by doing the exact same thing, which is dividing it by 50 or the total number of observations. Now, you could type 50 in here and then just copy it down. But if things had changed in the future where you can add data, the data set gets larger, now you're going to have a higher number. Well, then I'm going to have to go back in and change everywhere that 50 was, or I could just use a cell reference. So when I copy this down, I always want it to be 50. So I'm going to freeze that cell reference, which is the total number of observations. Now, when I copy this down, that number of observations cell reference wasn't changing, but it was updating to be using the frequency of whatever bin I was looking at. Now here, it's a good check, because if I've done things correctly, what should these relative frequencies add up to? So if I add these up, one thing we said in class is they add up to 1, right? If we have counted every single observation, these relative frequencies should add up to 1. And if I wanted to, I can select my labels, hold Control or Command on a Mac, select my relative frequencies, go to Insert, this column or bar chart, and now I've got my histogram as well. It's just instead of the frequency, now my y-axis is the relative frequency, right? Or proportion of the observations that were in each one of these bins, okay? And we said it won't change the relative size of the categories to each other, so it looks kind of identical to what if we use the frequencies. It's just that our y-axis values will be a little bit different. Now, one thing I don't want you to do here, I always want you to come up with the relative or the frequencies of the relative frequencies using this Countifs formula, then inserting a bar graph. What I don't want you to do, and if you Google this, you might find it, but I can select my entire column of data, right? Control Shift or Command Shift on a Mac, hit the down arrow. And then there's an option here that looks like a histogram, and it's called a statistics chart. Oh, okay, sure enough. Why don't I just do the histogram here? Well, you can, but notice it kind of uses that optimal bin length. It rounds it. It doesn't quite going to give you exactly what you always want. Notice, especially if I give you specific, if you were just to use the optimal bin length, this is pretty close. However, if you wanted to graph out these bins, which are a little bit smaller than the optimal length, and kind of create this catch-all category, well, then that kind of built-in histogram doesn't work. Now you can go through and change the options, and I've had people try to do this before. I've only had like 1 or 2 students ever use this built-in tool correctly once the kind of bins given to you aren't what they kind of would default to, right? Or be that kind of optimal bin length. And so once you start playing around with the options here to get it to match up some more custom bins, it's very difficult. And honestly, like I said, I've only seen a couple people get it right, and so most people lose points. So when I ask you to do a histogram, I don't want you to use this built-in tool. Not only do I not want to use the built-in tool, I'm going to regrade you on that first Excel assignment for how well you use the Countifs formulas. Now, that's partially because I think it's a better way to do these histograms. Also, I can continually update if I use cell references. If I add data to my sample data set later on, it'll automatically update everything and update the graph. Also, I want you, like I said, I'm going to grade you on that Countifs formula because we're going to use it moving forward as well. But I also think it's a good way, you know, I also think it's the optimal way to do these histograms, but more so than that, it's going to help us moving forward. Okay. So once you got your frequencies, just insert one of these bar graphs. Okay. Now you could also do my percent relative frequency. We said in class, all that's going to be is take my relative frequency and multiply it by 100, right? So I can drag that down, copy that down. Now I've got my percent relative frequencies. If I wanted to, I could graph those as well. And I'm putting a histogram, now the y-axis. The only thing that would be different, so I select my labels, I select my frequencies. The only thing that looks different about this graph is the y-axis now has my percent relative frequencies. Okay. So the last thing that I want to do here with this frequency data is calculate something we call a cumulative frequency. So the idea of a cumulative frequency, and I'm going to draw something on a word here so I don't have to switch over to a camera. I think it'll make sense. So the idea of a cumulative frequency is this. So let me see. There we go. That'll be all right. So let's say this is like my lowest bin. So this is like 0 to, I don't know, what, 7,500. So we'll just use 75. And then here's my second bin, greater than 75 up to, what did I have? We've been 1,500, so 150. So the idea is for cumulative, I'm going to have the frequency for each one of my bins, right? And maybe here, I don't know, let's say this one is 2, and this one is 5. All right, so scroll down a little bit here. Oh, I can't scroll down. So this is the idea of just a normal frequency. If I want to make them cumulative, what I would do is for the very first category, right? I'll draw this up here so I don't have as much room. So for that first category, the cumulative frequency will be exactly the same as whatever its frequency was, because cumulative is like cumulative GPA. It means take the GPA from the current semester all the way back to the very beginning. Well, for the first bin, taking the frequency of the first bin and adding them up all the way back to the very beginning, well, it is the beginning. So that the cumulative frequency for that first bin will always just be the frequency of that bin. Now for the second bin, the cumulative frequency, just like cumulative GPA, take your GPA from the current semester all the way back. So take the frequency of the current bin, which is 5, and add up the frequencies of everything below it. So 5 plus 2, the cumulative frequency would actually be 7 here. And, you know, if we had, let's say the next bin had a frequency of 3, then the cumulative frequency for that bin would be for the frequency of this bin, which is 3, plus every bin below it. So 3 plus 5 plus 2, which would be what? 10 up here. Okay. Now, another way to think about this is I can take the frequency of the current bin and add every bin below it, but the frequency of every bin below that should be the cumulative frequency of the bin right before the one I'm looking at. So I'm just going to call this bin 3 instead of running the numbers just to make it a little easier here. So here, to get the cumulative frequency for my third bin, I could just take the cumulative frequency of the bin right before it, which is 7. You know, really what that's representing is what's the probability I see something less than 150, right? This bin plus every bin below it. So here, I'll take the frequency of the current bin, 3, add it to the cumulative frequency of the bin right below it, 3 plus 7, that would also give me that cumulative frequency of 10. So there's multiple ways of doing the same thing. Okay. Excuse me, I'm getting a little bit better, but I'm still a little bit of a nastiness. All right, so back to Excel. How can we do this cumulative frequency pretty quickly? Right? Well, for the very first bin, the cumulative frequency is just going to be the frequency of the lowest bin, right? Because if I go from the current bin all the way, to any bin below it, well, there's no bin below it. It's the first bin, so my cumulative frequency is just whatever its frequency is. The cumulative frequency of the next bin would mean I could take the frequency of this current bin and add to that the frequency of every bin below it. There's only one bin below it, now I'm done. Cumulative frequency of the next bin, I would take its frequency, add to it the frequency of every bin below it. So I can do this, and I can do this cell by cell, that's fine. It'll give me the correct answers. Now, one thing that should be true is hopefully once I get to that final bin, my cumulative frequency should just be every single observation, right? Because if I'm looking at the frequency of the highest bin plus every bin below it, that's really just adding up all my frequencies there. So another shortcut I can do here, it's instead of typing these in every single time since they're a little different, is that I'm always going to want to take the frequency of the current bin and add to it the cumulative frequency of the bin right before it. So here I've got kind of it's shadowing here, but it's in cell what? S7, right? So I should always take the frequency of the bin I'm looking at plus the cumulative frequency of the bin before it, right? That was the second way that I showed you how to do it when I was kind of drawing those out there. So now if I copy this down, notice it updates that I'm always looking at the current bin's frequency and the cumulative frequency of every bin below it. Sorry, the cumulative frequency of the bin right before it, which remember the cumulative frequency is just, the cumulative frequency, another way of thinking about it was, if I was to just take the frequency of the current bin and every bin below it, right? That's what that cumulative frequency is representing. And so essentially, when I've used this format, these cell references, to take the frequency of the current bin and the cumulative frequency of the bin right before it, that'll add up the frequency of every single bin below that, okay? So that's how I do cumulative frequencies. And hopefully, if I've done it correctly, once I get to the last bin, I'll get my total number of observations there, okay? All right, so I could graph these cumulative frequencies the same way. A lot of the times what we'll see, I think the book, and I might have some slides on this, it calls it an ogive, like you select your cumulative frequencies and then you graph them as like a line graph. I don't know, it's kind of a stupid name. I'm not gonna expect you to know that. Just know that you can put that into a graph if you want to. It kind of shows you how quick, a little bit of a different look at the distribution of the data. We can come up with cumulative frequencies. And I have put up the first Connect assignment after I've posted this video. So it'll have some questions related to this idea of cumulative frequencies. So one way to think about this is the cumulative frequency, like let's say I choose this bin. So you look at the height of that bin, which is 30,000. What this is really saying for the cumulative frequency is it's like the frequency that X is less than whatever the maximum of that bin is. So as opposed to being in between 22,500 and 30,000, it's every observation that's less than that 30,000. So the next thing we can do, if we go to sheet 3, we can look at how do we create what we call scatter plots. And they attempt to give us the relationship between the two variables. So here I've got an X variable, which is the percent of a state that's vaccinated, and a Y variable, which is the number of new cases they have. Okay. So I can go to select these two variables. So I'll highlight them, Control Shift, hit the down arrow, and don't kind of ignore this for a second. So we've got our X variable and our Y variable. What the scatter plot will do is it'll plot every single one of these observations. So it'll go over to 57.3 on the X-axis, and then up to 272 on the Y-axis, and then draw a dot for that observation. And then we'll do the same for every single other observation we have. So if we've got those two variables selected, and we go to Insert, and we go to this one. So this is our scatter plot option where we've got all these little dots. Now I've got my scatter plot. Now, one thing that would be nice is if I could identify, well, before I go on, sorry, I jumped the gun. What we would do with this scatter plot data is try to think about, okay, what does it look like the relationship between these two variables are? Like if I had to draw a line that best fit this data, where would it be? And we've got some weird observations up here, kind of some outliers. For the most part, it looks like maybe the line would be kind of downward sloping, where initially it's falling quite a bit. So as I get more people vaccinated, the number of new cases starts to fall. But then it looks like there's a threshold, right? Anything over 60,000, it looks like it's kind of a straight line, or there's not much of a relationship. So maybe there's this is evidence that there might be a threshold, right? For if you get a certain percent of your population vaccinated, then the number of cases stays relatively low. Now, this is by no means a perfect look at this particular example, right? We would probably want the number of cases per person. And I'll update some of this data, and we'll use some COVID data kind of moving throughout the semester, kind of timely since I'm recording this while currently under quarantine. So one thing that I was almost jumping the gun earlier was that I might want to be able to identify which of these observations represent what states. So if I left click on them, kind of notice it selects a bunch of these dots, and then I right click, and then I go to add data labels, and then click on them again, right click, format data labels. Notice that there's an option here under format data labels that is the value from cells. So I'm going to select this, and then I'm going to hit this arrow, and I'm going to select what the name of the observation should be, which is just their state name. So I can select these states, hit that arrow again, hit OK. And now notice here, it's giving me not only the state name, but the actual value for the number of new cases. Now I could turn that off, so I just see the state name. Excuse me. But those are some options we have. Okay. The final thing I wanted to show you here, and go for the last however many years. So here's my year, here's my unemployment rate. And one thing we can do, if I don't want to type a bunch of things in, if I want to go up by 1 year, and I right click and drag these down, I go to fill series, it'll update them all by year. Keep filling the series, so up to 2021. Right? So what is it? 2010 down to 5.3. So it took me a little bit of time there, but this is kind of an interesting example where we could look at, okay, what's the unemployment rate over the time, over this year's time period. So all I'm going to do is select these two variables, go to insert, and then just do a line graph. Now notice if I do it this way, I've got a problem. So I wanted just to graph this unemployment rate, but something weird's going on where it's graphing my years as well. So I'm going to hit Control Z to undo what I just did. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to only select this unemployment rate variable. I'm going to do a line graph there. Okay, so I've got my unemployment rate. But what I would like to see is my time periods be here on the x-axis. So this is great, right? It looks like from 2010, unemployment was declining up until COVID here. Although it's hard for me to tell if that's COVID or not because I don't know what year it is. So I'll click here on my x-axis, selects the numbers. I'm going to right click and then go to select data. So my axis labels here, notice now they're just 1 through 11. I'm going to edit and then click that little arrow to select the years. Now, when I hit OK, it'll put those years as my x-axis labels there. Okay. So I highlighted that. I clicked on the numbers. I right-clicked on them, went to select data, edited the axis labels, and then just selected the cells that had those years in them. Now I've got a nice time series graph. And if I wanted to, you know, I don't know. Well, I'll just show you. Let's assume that here's Canada's unemployment rate, and here's the United States unemployment rate. And let's just assume Canada's is always 1% higher. So that way we've got two states now. Now I could highlight the data, insert a graph where I've got now the US and Canada graphed on the same line. And then once again, I can change the chart title to make sure people know it's the unemployment rate. I can right click on the x-axis labels, select data, edit, and select the years. Now you'll notice I've got my nice time series graph with the time periods. Okay. So that's a little bit look at how we do, you know, more with histograms, more with like cumulative frequencies. We also took a look at how we do a scatter plot, also how you do a time series graph. All of this should help in the Excel assignment that will be posted. I also have a Connect assignment that will now be posted after I post this video. We haven't worked through all the material yet, but you can probably get about halfway through it, maybe a little more than halfway through. So 7 or 8 out of the 15 questions will be over stuff we've talked up to this point. And hopefully, you know, I'm feeling pretty good today. But my hope is that you know, I'll have no symptoms the next couple of days, and you know, I'll take a test, and then should be able to be back in class on Monday. Okay, so I've got a Connect and Excel assignment out there now. I'll splice together all of the Excel stuff so we can see kind of the stuff we did in class plus this additional video, and I will hopefully see you guys in class on Monday.